then I'm gonna share that link in the group. That's gonna work. It has to.
We're streaming live on YouTube now.
I'm working on it right this second. Yes. Okay, we are live on YouTube. I'm going to place this link in the Facebook.
Okay.
All right, Mutor, I'm doing this in 10 seconds, so be ready to go.
Dokie.
Hey, hold on. So we got a new link. Can you share with me, please?
Yeah. Okay. Where do you want me? Okay. Where do you want me to send it? Before?
Same place, Facebook Messenger.
Okay.
So it's on YouTube
Can
now?
Can you put a copy of the link in the chat in Zoom for me?
Yep.
If you don't mind.
Okay. Hold on. I'm working on it right now.
Okay.
All right. And we are live on YouTube right now. So you guys can go ahead and just get started. It's showing us, it's the YouTube is a split-second delay. So go ahead and start.
Okay. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen in Facebook and YouTube land. My name is Dr. Mutor Flood, and this is the Great Debate League. Today, our topic is on, is genocide is abortion a form of genocide? That is our topic for this week's debate. Now, we're not going to have our traditional debates like we've had the last two times. Unfortunately, we had someone who was going to debate drop out. And so what we're doing now is we're going to have more of a round robin forum where our two debate guests, Janaba and Esther, will discuss their sides of their positions on the issue. And I, Bruce, and Ebony and AJ will also kind of take turns in asking questions or looking more in depth on their argument. We also encourage the people that are watching this debate live on either Facebook or YouTube to pose questions so that we can ask our guests those questions and they can answer it to further delineate their positions on these topics. So with that being said, I would like for the two ladies to introduce themselves. Let's start with Esther. Esther, can you please introduce yourself to the public at large?
Sure. So hello, everyone. Apologies for my setting in advance. I have little ones. My little guy has autism and he can be quite noisy. So I literally have to run to my car to hide from my kids. So that's where I'm here. Okay, so I am the head of strategic development for a cybersecurity firm called Offensive Security. I am a data science nerd, right? I was actually pursuing my master's in data science and my job role kind of took up most of my life, so I wasn't able to continue that. Hopefully I'll be able to go back. My background is in the biochem sciences prior to me entering engineering and programming. And my position today is that abortion is not a form of genocide. But I'll state my position and everything else after we do the intros.
All right, thank you. All right, Janova, you want to take it away?
Yes, I'm Janaba. I was born in Oakland, California as a legacy child of the Black revolutionary struggle of the 60s. I'm a solid revolutionary vanguard spreading the gospel of African internationalism. And I continue the legacy as a speaking member of the Uhuru Movement's International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement organization, dedicated to peace, bread, and Black power. If you've heard the song Wolves by Dead Prez, then you're familiar with my grandfather, the founder of the Uhuru Movement, chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, and leader of the African Nation, Chairman Omali Ishitela. And you can reach out to me if you want to learn more about how African internationalism can bring material change that we need to your community. And I won't really go into all of the, work that I might have done serving others, but I am a huge biology nerd. I am a molecular cellular biology lover. I work in biotech, and I just love science, even social science. So that's my intro.
All right. Thank you, Janaba, for that introduction. All right. So what I'm going to do is move on to explaining or defining what we're using as a definition for what constitutes genocide. And so the definition that I'm going to be using is from the UN General Assembly. So the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide was adopted by the UN General Assembly on the 9th of December in 1948 and came into effect on the 12th of January of 1951. We're going to be using its Article 2. So they describe genocide as any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. As such, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So that's the definition we'll be using for this debate. What I want to do is open it up for Janaba to give her introduction. That introduction is going to be, I believe, 2 minutes. So go for it, Janaba.
I believe it's 2.5 minutes.
Yes, thank you for the correction. 2.5 minutes, go for it.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna jump right into it. We're in an interesting time in history where the worldwide cry is for Black power. And tonight you're gonna witness two long lost sisters reunite and have an exchange of ideas, an opportunity that many African women were denied both physically and in other, shall we say, clever ways. Some of my sources include the books Medical Apartheid by a sister named Harriet Washington, Smart Sister graduated Harvard, as well as Nutricide by Laila Africa, May He Rise in Power, as well as a petitioning document from the Africans Charged Genocide campaign, a petition that takes arguments just like the ones we're having now to the UN, not as a solution, but as a strategy to raise global awareness about what's going on in Black communities in the United States today. I'm Janaba Phillips, and I'm not a feminist, and this is not an argument that Black women should not be able to get abortions. I'm an African internationalist, and we believe African women at home and abroad should have control over our own lives so that we avoid parasites who have historically become so much of an interrupting force in our lives that we now have to debate if their actions in this particular discussion, abortion, is considered genocide according to their own definition. We know that parasitic capitalism is at the origin of what was the trade of our ancestors' bodies, and the businesses based on this model have no interest in the people. And don't forget that the biggest plantations had the most poverty, which is the #1 reason for abortion, not just for African women in the US, but all women in this upside down system. Again, this isn't an argument that Black women should not have abortions, because we should when exercised in our own interests. However, the relationship African women have with Europeans were not exercised in our interests. We the people know that abortion is a form of genocide based on the fact that the unintended pregnancies resulting in abortion occurs mostly in poor people. And we know that the role poverty has played in some of history's largest recorded genocides. You know, they always lose the records or body cam footage when it comes to us, but that's my position. Uhuru.
All right, thank you, Janaba, for that introduction. All right, I'm going to take it. I'm going to give the mic over to Esther. Go forward. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds, Esther.
Okay, so unfortunately, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage. I was asked to do this last minute tonight, and literally at 7 o'clock, so I didn't have a chance to gather up resources. But what I can say is I am a feminist. I do think feminism is a dirty word in the Black community, and mainly because it's misunderstood for what the intentions are. But that aside, as far as reproduction being something that women need to control, especially when they're in impoverished situations, is something that I absolutely stand for. So on that, we are definitely both in agreement. I think women should absolutely be able to control when and where they give birth. I think we need to trust women when it comes to making those decisions and empower them. I think any type of economic gains that we've had as a community in this country and abroad is directly linked to being able to have control over one's reproductive rights, and that includes access to safe abortions. With that being said, that doesn't mean to me that the history of abortions itself is not problematic. I'm very well versed on the history in this country, on the eugenics movement, and so on and so forth. But to say that at this current stage, that making safe abortions available to women, specifically women who might not have the same types of access to reproductive prophylactics, right, is not, I just don't think it's conducive, right, to say that this is not something that we need. I think there might be alternative ways to get it to the community. I think the focus should be on perhaps access to birth control, safe access to better education on sexual health, better education, or better access rather to just medicine and healthcare in general. But to take the leap to call abortion genocide, I think I just don't think there's anything there that really backs that up. And I don't know if you guys want me to keep talking, I'll keep talking.
No, if you're done, Esther, then that's fine. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, because this is more of a round table discussion, I'm going to open it up to questions from myself, Dr. Bruce, Ebony, and Professor AJ, and the audience at large. So I guess I'll start with my first question. Now I'm basing my question off of the actual UN definition, where the UN definition is pretty explicit. It says what they consider to be genocide is any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy. So I'm going to key in on that terminology, the intent to destroy a racial group. So that would be people of African descent. And calculated to bring about their physical destruction in whole or in part, or imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. So based off that definition, Esther, and opening up to Janaba, do you feel that definition from the UN encapsulates what the debate question is, which is abortion a form of genocide based on the UN definition?
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, you can take that.
Sure. So no, I do not.
Okay.
So in whole or in part, the destruction of a racial group, I think if we saw a clear decline, right, in the numbers of people in the Black community, then I could support that. While within the Black community itself, how you count, Black people might be a question. Unfortunately, again, I don't have the data sets in front of me, but as far as the Black community goes, there hasn't been any indication that there is a decline in the US. If anything, if we're talking about the global community, Black people or people of African descent or Africans in general outnumber whites globally, just period, right? So I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Africa right now is one of the top 3, if not one in the top 5. I believe it's in the top 3 populations that are growing, and it outpaces growth in Europe and in Asia by a rate of like 3 to 1 or something. This is all stuff I'm gonna have to go back and like verify and like repost to you guys. I don't like doing stuff like this ad hoc, but it is what it is. But with knowing that, it's really hard to suddenly suggest that we are at a place where we are under attack, or to argue that we are somehow being decimated right? When it comes to the question of birth, right, or the way the definition is worded, if those abortions also were paired with sterilization, I would agree, right? But that's not the case. These women, for one reason or the other, might not be ready to have children, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they won't have children later. There is a trend that is irrefutable in Western markets and in what they're considering first world or global north markets. So like the US, Europe, Far East Asia, like Japan, South Korea, where rise in income does seem to equal a decline in the birth rate. But that's also paired with, you know, increased responsibilities on women who are working full time, the amount of care and cost of raising children. Childcare is very expensive, education is very expensive. With all of those things combined together, it makes sense that a family would go from having 6, 7, maybe up to 9, 10 children to 1 or 2, right? It just makes good sense as far as household management, the cost of care, and you know, just in just general common sense, I think, in a lot of ways. I don't see any indication based on the UN definition that supports genocide in the Black community.
All right, thank you for that response, Esther. I'm going to pose the same question to Janaba. Would you like to rebut Esther's statement at all?
Yeah, well, I will say that I really want to approach this in a very scientific way. It's important to illustrate why I say that abortion is a form of genocide in the US. See, in 1961, not 1861, but 1961, a sharecropper in Mississippi entered the hospital to have a knot on her stomach removed. What she didn't know was that the surgeon was her plantation owner's cousin who bragged about removing her uterus without her knowing. And when word got back to her, she went to the doctor. She asked why, and of course, he said nothing because he didn't have to, And then when asked about a lawsuit, she said, and I quote, "At that time, me getting a white lawyer against a white doctor, I would have been taking my hands and screwing tacks in my casket." I'm not sure if we're familiar with Fannie Lou Hamer, but she would become one of the world's biggest civil rights leaders. Again, my statement is not against abortion because of how it sounds or how we need to move around in these politics. I'm against abortion when my people who are already displaced and forced into a terrible economic relationship now have to deal with eugenicists who call themselves doctors. This is a historical relationship that's not isolated to any, any US territories, even though that should be the focus for the argument. Speaking in terms of the fact that Africa is just now being able to recover, where in most cases the lifespan was not even in the 30s due to colonialism, we on the other side of the pond here have our own set of contradictions that we have to overturn. There's no doubting that the medical socioeconomic fabric of this country is rooted in slavery, which is anti-African by its origin. And unfortunately, poverty plays a big deal in how economics are run. It is the #1 reason why women are getting abortions, especially what's called unplanned pregnancies. And it's directly related, and I can name off 3 specific already proven to be classified as genocide tactics of poverty used against people, especially in the cases of Holodomor and in the Rwandan genocide. It's already been taken. We need to take a stance to push issues that outside of abortion need to be tacked on and charged as genocide. That's why we have the petition today.
All right, thank you, Janaba, for that response. I'm going to center the discussion on agency, because in the Facebook chats, agency did come up. You can feel that by stating that genocide, that abortion is genocide for Black people in America. I'm focusing on America. You feel that takes away the agency of Black women. and is in fact could be somewhat misconstrued as being anti-woman or anti-black.
Okay, so I guess I'm going first here too, or Jennifer?
No, that was for Janova. That was for Janova.
I don't think that I understand the question. Could you repeat
Yeah,
it?
sure. Do you think that by stating that abortion is a form of genocide for black people, that we're robbing black women of agency? Because ultimately, they are the people. They are the person who's making the ultimate choice on if they want to go through with an abortion.
Yeah, that's actually one of the major cases that was made in medical apartheid. The problem that existed, so over 70% of Black women are supportive of abortion. That's not the issue. The issue is that 50% of those women don't trust the doctors. Why? Because of a historical relationship that we have. This is not an isolated incident. It's historical, and we're just talking about one thing. And there are several other instances, including the recent murder of George Floyd, which has been investigated by the UN, but Mike Pompeo restricted their visas. They can't even do a human rights investigation. This is what we're going against. When we say we don't have the numbers and things like that, what does that mean in the great context where we can't even get basic right issues to the UN that should be classified as genocide?
Thank you. Esther, do you want to chime in on that this particular question?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think it's possible to say abortion is genocide when the majority of abortions are not committed. Well, I don't know. I don't like the word committed or perpetrated, but they're not coming from Black women, right? The majority of abortions is still very much coming from white women. I would have to look at what the rates are within the communities, and I don't have, again, that data in front of me, so I apologize. But I would, without even knowing what the rates are, I can say that when we're, again, like kind of what I phrased earlier, if we're talking about poverty, if we're talking about economic disparities, it's hard to keep Black women on equal footing or moving forward as we have. We made a lot of economic gains through increased levels of college degree access and increased gains in education, increased gains in income. All of these things are, again, tied directly to reproductive health. Now, that said, I understand the desire to tie this to the history of racism, but there's no facet of Black life in this country that's not tied to some history of racism. That aside, right, with knowing that, I think it's important whenever you're evaluating or discussing history, whether it's medical history or civil rights history, and right now these two are intersecting for this conversation, right? It's important when talking about these things to keep them within the context of the period that they're in. The history of abortion is troubling. There's really no question about that. Its origins, its roots, medical racism is still very much real and with us today. That's why I said earlier, a big part of the solution, if we're concerned about abortions in the Black community, is access to reproductive health. More Black doctors, encouraging more young Black people to join the medical field. Although Black women, we dominate that as nurses, and we have way more young Black doctors entering the field, but continuing to encourage that, changing the way that the communities are engaged within healthcare. And these are not easy solutions, but when it comes to a question of agency and giving women the ability to choose, it's very hard to say that we're respecting that and at the same time saying that women are murdering babies or Black women are responsible for adverse effects of birth rates in the Black community because they're choosing to not have children that maybe they can't afford, or maybe they're not ready for, maybe emotionally or physically they don't feel supported to take care of, whatever it might be. I think it would be interesting to add into this conversation the role of men as fathers, the role of men in these types of relationships, right? Like if we're going to talk about, young mothers or mothers of any age really like being unwed, and or like that goes into like single parenting, or we're talking about women not, you know, having children that, you know, weren't planned for. You know, it takes two to tango. So we can talk about how these things tie back to good sexual health education, good understanding of reproductive health, good understanding of consequences, right? And choosing to protect oneself ahead of time if you have the access to, because it's not fair to even assume that the people who are in these situations are in these situations because they want to be. Sometimes it's as simple as they can't get access to the birth control that they need, or they don't have just maybe the right to say no, whatever it might be. There's a whole slew of situations that can be discussed here around this.
All right. Thank you. I have a question from the actual audience. This is from Shayla McDonald. And the way the question is worded, I think it's posed mostly to Janaba. So I'm gonna ask her this question. So Shayla McDonald writes, considering that white women are on a decline in babies, only leading Asian women, but none others, and the USA needs Black people to sustain America, what benefit do they have to get rid of Black babies? And let's see, this is the wording of this. Okay, so also considering that white women are also on a decline of babies, only leading Asian women, but none others, and the USA needs Black people to sustain America, what benefit do they have to get rid of Black babies, since they need a population, especially Black people, to help them remain in a profit status?
Again, the focus is the relationship that you have with the people. If your medical system is profiting off of people in prison, perhaps you might create laws that inadvertently target a certain population. This is not, we're not talking long ago. Fannie Lou Hamer, that was 1961. Okay, most of our parents were born around then. My grandfather was born in 1940. 33. But my point is that this wasn't very long ago. The relationship is the problem. A lot of the issues are tied into the relationship. Henrietta Lacks is an example of a negative relationship that occurred due to the fact that they could take her cells without her permission. These are things that would not happen to white women. So the relationship that exists is a parasitic one. The problem is not that someone wants to kill. I've never said that. That's not the argument here. The argument is that there is a relationship that we have with a system that's predominantly governed by a group of people who initially started it, and it will allow people, you can become the best Black capitalist if you'd like, but you will still have a relationship based on how they frame it to be. For example, a Black person could be a slave trader. That's just a fact. But what does the relationship exist? How does the relationship exist? That's the focus. It's not about some extermination conspiracy technique. These are historical relationships that, even though we think have suddenly vanished or dissipated, they have restructured into different institutionalized systems. Exploitation can occur. This is not a racist issue, okay? Fannie Lou Hamer was not, we don't even know that guy, okay? The problem is that gentleman had the opportunity, the ability to do that with no repercussions.
Thank you. So I guess my next question would be this, and Esther kind of alluded to it in her opening statements and other answers to questions, but can we call abortion for Black people genocide if the outcomes aren't showing that there's a decline in the birth rates globally of African peoples? That question is going to be directed to you, Janaba.
I'm sorry, I thought the question was directed to her. Can you repeat that?
My bad. So basically, kind of Esther talked about, the outcomes being an important indicator of if something is actually genocide. Now we know the African population is growing. If abortion is a form of genocide and African populations are growing. Is there a disconnect there? Could those two, are those two mutually exclusive? Are they related? Can you have a genocide when the population is growing?
Absolutely.
Globally.
Absolutely. And that is because what tends to happen is this. You have a trend. We do not exist in some vacuum. The same way that the birth rate is increasing for African people, the birth rate is increasing for other groups of people around the world. That also does not exclude the fact that a system can serve. Again, it's not about some extermination technique. I think the focus here is turning into like, why? It's not even a white and black thing. It started off as one, but a lot more people are getting involved. The issue can also be skewed based on the fact that you have poverty levels that are not talked about, that actually you have 245,000 people are dying out of poverty. This is the same as pretty much like heart disease. No one is talking about the fact that poverty is killing us. So it's not just a black and white thing. It's a systematic thing that doesn't just encompass, are we trying to be exterminated? We can have a growth in population because, well, we are quite dominant. In fact, we're having more people come from other places following their resources to the United States. That throws off numbers. But globally, we're the most dominant. We're 1 billion strong. So comparing that, I wouldn't say that you'd even be able to numerically argue that. It just doesn't even make sense.
All right. Thank you for that. So I guess my next question would be, what is men? Well, let me backtrack on that. Let me pose a hypothetical to Esther. All right. So we talked about the outcomes, right? That, okay, so, the African population globally is booming. That may not be seen in Black Americans for a variety of reasons having to do with, choices made on a daily basis to survive economically. When others have posed the argument that that abortion is genocide, what they usually say is that, hey, the babies that would have been born had they not been killed in the womb outside of normal levels of miscarriage by women in utero, those babies more or less would have been born and grown up. And now if we go by when abortion was made legal in 72 with Roe v. Wade, that those people now, in 72, those people now would be in their 50s, close to being 50, and that they would have their own children. So we're looking at, almost 2 generations of Black children being aborted, who would make the African population in America from what is now 47 million. It probably could be upwards of like 80 million right now. So what do you say to that kind of question or that kind of statement?
I think it's a really fair statement, and I think it's one of those things where abortion is it's an imperfect tool. It's not something that in a perfect world we would need, right? But at the same time, abortion is something that's been practiced in Black civilization since way before slavery. I'm from the Caribbean myself, and in the Caribbean, it's not unusual for women to go to, I'm trying to think of what the term is, but the equivalent of like a doula or a midwife, right? To get a tea to try to get rid of a baby or whatever it might be. So, and within the slave communities, we have it documented that this was going on as well. So the women attempting to take control of their reproductive destiny is probably as old as time. Medically induced
Sorry, Esther?
Let's give her a second.
It's gruesome. I don't know if my connection.
Esther, you cut out for a second, so if you could just backtrack a little bit.
Okay, what I was saying was I know medical induced abortions, I think, has taken over people's imaginations because of the violence that's involved in it, right? But the overall attempt of women to not have to bear children that they, again, for whatever reason, aren't ready for, literally is as old as time. I think, you know, if you speak to the women from prior generations, our grandmothers, great grandmothers, I'm sure they have stories. I'm sure they know women who have stories. People throw, you know, just all kinds of nightmares of how this was handled prior to having a sanitized solution for it. Not a perfect tool. Those are a lot of lives that were snuffed out, right? For lack of a better word. I'm sensitive to that. I am not, you know, absent to the plight, but I know lots of women who have been in very difficult circumstances that needed to be able to make these difficult decisions for themselves, right? Because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to raise these children along with their, hopefully, partners, husbands, whatever it might be. And it's really a personal and a family decision. It shouldn't be something that's imposed externally, regardless of what your opinion is.
All right. Thank you. I have another question from the group. So this question, I'm not sure who's posed to, but is Planned Parenthood an organization that is promoting abortion for genocide within the African American community, as many have stated?
So
Yeah,
should I
whoever
take
wants to
that
answer
one?
that. Yeah,
Jennifer,
you
I
can
don't know
take
if you
it.
want to, I guess we could both answer.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fine.
so I would say no. I would say the again, history and context, right? The history of Planned Parenthood as an agency is very, very troubling. Planned Parenthood overall does very few abortions. A lot of abortions are done by third-party independent clinics. A lot of times, a trip to Planned Parenthood is a trip to being redirected to another clinic, one of these third-party clinics that would actually do the abortion. These relationships are informal between organizations, right? They're not, it's not like Planned Parenthood is sponsoring or paying or whatever. A lot of times it's a woman's insurance or state-based insurance or whatever it might be that's paying for this. It's just one of those distractions. A lot of times, like every few years, Planned Parenthood makes headlines because, you know, some politician wants to cut funding or whatever it might be, for whatever reason. And a lot of times what they're really doing is cutting funding that pays for access to like breast exams, right? Or to annual pap smears for very poor women. And this goes right back to the conversation we started with here, where a key part of this, if we find the history of these organizations problematic, and we are currently living in a time where a lot of our young people especially are looking at history and they want answers, right? And they want better solutions than what, you know, those of us who are a little bit older have tolerated. And I'm 1,000% for that. We do need better solutions. I think we need healthcare that's brought to our community by people who look like us for our community and who have different incentives in mind. For Planned Parenthood, I don't think they are a malicious organization, but I do find their history troubling. I would rather see them replaced with, you know, a doctor in the community who knows the community well and, you know, grew up with the kids that are in the community, watch them grow up and is serving, like truly serving, and not just, you know, proliferating all over the country and finding a new way to make profits. So.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so Janet, I have another question from the group, and this one is, let's see, let me read this. So why is it that Planned Parenthood and other clinics advocating abortion are only marketed and advertised in urban areas, whereas in suburban areas, you have to quote unquote Google them?
Well, what I'll say is that the history of Planned Parenthood, while Margaret Sanger, the founder, was pretty much lauded as like a human rights feminist, she definitely quickly had issues being labeled as a eugenist. The reality is that when we talk about this relationship, again, medic-social relationships that African people have with these programs that we, you know, tend to talk about as if we already don't have a number of issues going on outside of abortion with women in our bodies, including sterilization. That continues on to this day, particularly in prisons. But what you find is that there is a hierarchy. It's just a standard clinical trial. And they usually begin in our communities. For example, there was a really big case where IUDs were inserted in women, and if they had sickle cell or issues like that, that they would result in the ability to not have a child. And they weren't informed of this. And so due to lots of results, especially from the legal battle that did result out of that, they were basically showing that they targeted our communities first. So there's like a hierarchy. You bring it to the Black community first. And then if it's approved and it passes whatever test, then you may find it in the other community. The problem is that with a lot of these drugs that they're testing, which we know that they are testing, they don't do very well. And so that's why you'll see much more marketing in our communities because and also the standard of care is different in the white community. If you're in an affluent community, predominantly white community, then your experience with your doctor is going to be way more personal. It won't be as many walk-in clinics and things like that. So marketing won't be done on the streets. You'll go in your doctor they've already proved that it works on most of our community. Then they'll say, we'll introduce this to your community.
Okay, thank you for that. Esther, I got a question for you. So it says, Esther, how do you hold that it is not genocide when the definition clearly states, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, close quote?
So I did answer something similar to this a little bit earlier, because the abortion itself doesn't stop a woman from having future pregnancies. It's not paired with sterilization. I would counter that it simply just is not preventing women from having children. It might be delaying, or if a woman already has children, in that case, it might be preventing, but it's preventing through choice. It's preventing through her own agency, as opposed to an external force coming in and declaring, you've had two, no more, and, being, what's the word, compulsory, right, abortions. That's not the case here. So there's no population control. If the Black community as a group decided we weren't going to do abortions anymore, there's really no state actor or no state agency. Maybe something would step in, who knows? But at the moment, there's no state actor or state agency that would step in and try to make abortions compulsory, right? So I just don't feel like it is. I did want to speak a little bit to the community thing. I do agree,
Yeah, go ahead.
Geneva, that part of the advertising in the suburbs, it's just different. And I do agree, like women, and I don't think that's a racial thing. I think you have affluent Black neighborhoods. I think you have affluent Black suburbs. Within those communities, you still wouldn't see any of this type of advertising. It's definitely a class thing. Just a real quick personal story. So when I was working in labs, I actually turned down one of my first interviews for a job in pharma because I was shocked to find out that a lot of times pharmaceutical companies set up their testing sites, which you would not think it's a testing site, right? In Black communities and poorer Black communities, and they pay people pennies, right? Like I think the most I saw was maybe like $12,000 to $13,000 to stay at a facility for up to a year, to use their bodies or volunteer their bodies as experimentation for drug companies. And that was a little bit more, a bridge too far for me than I could tolerate, and it was not a job that I was able to take. But it was shocking, and it was kind of a call. I would not be surprised that medical experimentation goes on in poorer communities on a wider scale, maybe first line of introducing drugs or whatever it might be. Even with all of that said, I still feel like it's a bit of a reach to lump what abortion currently is, which is an established medical practice, with some of these other more malicious practices that go on.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to ask one more question to each of y'all, and then we are going to go to closing statements. So a question I got from the group is, then I'm going to direct this one to Janaba. Does Hollywood push images that promote Black women being, quote, better off without children due to poverty, missing men in the home, etc.?
That's a tough one for me to answer personally because I am more of a reader than a TV watcher.
Okay.
And when I do turn on TV, it's a lot of drawings, animation. So from what I understand, there is a large movement to increase the positive images of Black women in the media, especially out of roles that tend to be, some sort of Jezebel, sassy Black woman, or the tough Black woman that doesn't need a man, or all of the different sapphire types. What I do know is that Black women historically have had a relationship with Hollywood that would very closely mimic the same relationship that we have medically, where we are on the bottom tier and have to fight to change our relationship with those who tend to have power over our lives.
Okay, and that brings me to another question that I'm going to pose to Esther, because you talked about agency, and yeah, obviously we don't talk in absolutes, but would you state that due to systemic racism, that Black women have lower levels of agency living in America than do other races of people, most notably, European people of European descent?
Okay, that's a really heavy question, and one that I could probably write essays on. Right, that's a heavy one, and a really tough one. A good question, actually. So I personally think, all right, I'm gonna say this, and I know I'm gonna get some blowback for it, but forgive me in advance, okay? I personally think that there is a lot of deliberate cultural coaxing that happens starting as early as the elementary level to make Black people in this country feel like their agency is limited. And I think too many people buy into that. That does not mean, right, that there aren't structural facets of racism. There's not hurdles that we have to overcome in this country that other groups don't. Those things are absolutely real and absolutely true. But I do feel that we are living in a time, for the first time in history, where we can demand a seat at the table in many instances, and don't, because we have bought into this idea that we're not allowed to, or we can't, or that will be rejected if we do. It's one of the things that is my own personal mission to try to counter, is this belief or perception that agency is limited. Now, if you are born like absolutely in entrenched poverty, right, and you have to, that's like the most extreme, right, and that's like where you have the most barriers to overcome to reach your goal, whatever it might be. I do think it would be harder for you being Black than it would be if you're white. I don't feel like it's impossible. When it comes to, so if we're talking about reproductive health and do these things affect their choices? Yes, I think some women are forced to use abortions because, again, pretty much what we were saying earlier, they just don't have the access, right? Or whatever the access might be requires, one of the things that gets on my nerves, and I know we need to wrap up, is something like means testing. So if a woman goes to a clinic and she says, I need birth control, and it turns out she makes $2 above whatever the maximum she's allowed to make is, she's no longer eligible, and now she has to come out of pocket $50 to $100, whatever it might be, for birth control because her insurance doesn't cover it or her job doesn't provide insurance. And this person is in that in-between space. And I feel like a lot of people end up occupying that in-between space, and they can't get the support and help that they need. And as a community, I feel like we have to have ways of creating our own resources to do better, because if we're waiting on states and if we're waiting on other communities to step in and help us, it's just not going to happen. And that all goes back to us believing that we have the resources that we need to make those changes happen.
All right, thank you. I'm going to pose that question to Janova because I saw her interest peaked when I posed it just a little bit.
Wait,
so go ahead, Janova.
Do you? I always want to make sure that I answer it properly. Do you mind repeating the question, please?
Yes, absolutely. So we talked a lot in this conversation about agency. Now, obviously we don't speak in absolutes. No one has 100% agency, but do you feel that the agency of Black people living under a system of white supremacy, racism, do you feel that Black people have a lower levels of agency as compared to other races of people, most notably Europeans?
Yes, I really hope that I'm understanding this correctly. Do you mind rephrasing it and saying it in a different way?
Yeah, so basically, do you feel that Blacks have less agency than whites in America due to racism?
Okay. One, I'm going to say this on racism. It's a hot word. I get it. But racism is an idea that somebody has about me. Fannie Lou Hamer was not fighting racism because, like that guy actually did something to her. The issue is colonialism. I know it's not a hot topic and we're not talking about it as much anymore, but that's a colonial issue. Due to colonialism, which is a material basis, we're not talking about how somebody feels about us or anything like that. Due to the material relationship, economic, political, it's all tied together. Due to the economic relationship that started this system that's at the expense of our bodies. We were the first capital. That's the origin of capitalism. We were the first capital, stocks and bonds, like all of this, but like we were traded. Bank of America is undergoing a call-in campaign for reparations because they used my people as collateral for loans. This is not some abstract thought. Absolutely, a foundation like that can only set you economically, we're talking here. I'm not saying how smart people are or anything. Economically, what that does is it creates an imbalance because my grandparents served on your land. Fannie Lou Hamer didn't even have an opportunity to have a child. We're talking about the focus is African women having control over our lives. The issues with the primary reason for abortion is due to the fact that we're talking about African women here, but it does include all women. A system that started due to our exploitation cannot allow us to supersede beyond a certain limit. And that's just a fact. There's no, it wasn't like a nice catchy twang when they said the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It was a fast way to explain a relationship. And that's the relationship that African people continue to serve. And it's the type of relationship that creates women who are anti-abortion because a doctor took her uterus out without permission. That's what we're facing in 1961.
All right, thank you, Janaba. And so we're going to move to the closing statements. I guess we'll start with Esther. You want to give your closing statement? You are allotted, let's see, got the amount of time for the closing statement. Give me a second. Let's see. 4 minutes, but obviously you didn't have as much time to prepare. So if you have less than that, that's completely fine.
Yeah, I don't have that much to say.
Okay.
I feel like I've said quite a bit, but I want to start by thanking my opponent here, Geneva, for bringing really strong arguments, very articulate, and for presenting an alternative perspective, right? But a really well thought one that's really well thought out. I think we approach it slightly differently because she's very passionate about the historical context, and it does matter, and it is something we do need to talk about more. Education and awareness are our friends, right? You don't know where you're going if you don't know where you're coming from. That said, I came into this on a position, and she and I are aligned on this position, it seems, right? Is that Black women do need to have this agency, and they do need to be able to have access to safe abortions. Our positions seem to differ on whether or not, as a community, we need to look at the historical context of this as part of defining genocide and what's happening within our communities. I still stand by the position that historical context matters, and while the origins of these things are troubling, we got to use the tools that we have available to us immediately, and these are the tools that we have for a path to safe abortion. If this is something we need to change in our community, I argue that we need to create space to encourage more young men and women to step up. Whoop, sorry, my son is joining me. He's the one I was running from, and he found me. But more space for safe abortions for women and for medical health care and safe access. I think on the topic of agency, we talked about that a bit, and on racism, these are things that we live with in this country, and overcoming them is something we've become particularly good at, right? I think we have proven over and over again that we can step up to this system and show ourselves to be above the bullshit that the system is. Pardon the language. I know you. I think you guys said something about swearing.
It's all good.
And I think for those of us who are in professional lives, like you guys, as professors who are teaching the generations that are coming up, and for someone like me and Geneva who are in the tech world, making space to create more leaders to follow us is crucial. The numbers might not be where we want them to be as far as population growth. Maybe in the future, the more we can get people's incomes up, the more they'll be able to support larger families. But for the time being, this is where we're at. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. And pass the mic over to Geneva for your closing statements. You have, I've been told it's actually 2 minutes for closing statements.
2 minutes. Okay.
Yes.
Well, I just really want to say that what's happening to African people is an international crime. That includes abortion, that includes prisons, that includes the state. And this relationship still carries implications for oppressed people, not just here in America, but all over the world. We know it's not just about one white woman who started a program. It's about the imbalance of power for this to even be a topic of concern. We need power over our own lives. We need control over our own resources. And we need to stop trying to change the ideas in somebody's head about who we are. There is a material relationship that if we are not going to inform ourselves of, we will continue to fall victim and believe that someone who started a relationship with you has suddenly changed their minds and don't care about, their profits, to be honest. We were their profits. And if it doesn't happen in our free communities, I guarantee you it's going to happen in the prison communities, and their lives matter too. African women have been brutalized for so long, including the so-called father of gynecology, some white guy who had access to my mothers and sisters and aunts, who gets to walk around and build a business out of somebody's plantation in their backyard with no anesthesia. We've been exploited and we need organization, and we know this, and I know this. We've heard the horror stories inside of the hospital, so I can only imagine what's happening inside of those clinics. We've heard from the doctors in those clinics, and according to their own numbers, abortions won't end until poverty ends, their system that they made. So we, the people, don't want a seat at the table because one, it ain't no seasoning when you serve me, and two, we need to build our own. That's a question.
Thank you, Janova, for that closing statement. And I want to thank you both ladies for a very important and well thought out conversation on if abortion is genocide in the Black community. Y'all have a great day. And thank you, audience in YouTube land and Facebook land for viewing. Have a great day. Peace, love, and light.
Thank you. Peace. Thank you so much, Esther.
It was a pleasure. You and I got to link up. I'd love to talk to you.
Right. Oh yes, and everyone sign the petition, please. We got over 100,000 signatures. We need 250,000.
For what? What's the petition on?
The African Charged Genocide petition. We're taking
gotcha.
it to you, and
Okay.
so I can share a link in the group chat, in the group.
Absolutely. Please do so.
All right.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Peace, y'all.